What do you think Britain's relationship should be with the EU?
Well, I believe, like a lot of people, that originally the EU sounded like a great idea. It sounded brilliant when it was a small cluster of countries, of strong countries working together and trading together, but it seems to have exceeded its bounds and grown in ways that people didn't anticipate. For example, we've now heard that Europe is thinking of having its own army, which is quite a terrifying prospect, that having Europe fighting our wars for us elsewhere in the world. I think, like most people, I'm concerned about the overreach of Europe, and I also don't believe that the United Kingdom needs to tether itself to the managed decline of Europe. I think the UK has a much brighter future than that, and the way to achieve it is for us to be partners with Europe, trading partners with Europe, friends of Europe, but not necessarily in the European Union.
So something similar to Switzerland?
Exactly. It's not a realistic prospect that any European country is going to not want to trade with the UK. We also have export markets all over the world in the Commonwealth, countries that have much more in common with us in terms of national character. It seems to me quite an obvious proposition that we would at this point leave the EU when it quite obviously no longer works for us.
Some people would say that if we left and had a relationship like Switzerland, that we would have to abide by rules while having no influence over them. So do you think?
Sure. I mean, there is that. If Europe has certain restrictions on quantities of things, on packaging sizes, all that kind of stuff, there's sort of endless red tape and pointless restrictions that they like to spread around Europe. If they're going to be that restrictive, they're going to find that some of the best stuff they want isn't available to them on the continent, because we have export markets all over the world. We have America, we have Australia, we have India, we have China. I don't think we need them as much as they need us.
So, in regards to withdrawing from the EU, obviously that links into UKIP. Do you think they're the answer to the European question, or do you think they're a bit extreme, like some people would say?
I don't think they're extreme, and I think most of the criticisms of them as being racist and whatever, I think we know that that's not true. We know that's not true from the number of ethnic minorities, from the number of sexual minorities, from the number of women who are in UKIP. The second most powerful person in UKIP is a woman. I think we know all of that's nonsense, so as far as the social issues go. Economically speaking, I agree with them, and I agree with many Tories who say that the European Union is not the best place for us. I do think Farage has got himself into a bit of an awkward position now. The Tories can quite plausibly claim that only really a vote for them is a way to get a referendum on Europe. But of course we've had cast iron guarantees from Cameron in the past, and they've amounted to nothing, so who knows. I would say this is probably still an election, like the European and local elections, to send a message that a large proportion of people in the UK really do want a choice as to whether we stay in Europe or not. Why not let the people decide? Why not let Brits determine their fate? I do believe that's the right thing, and it seems to me like having a couple of UKIP MPs in Parliament would certainly help keep Cameron to his word.
Okay, recently we had the tragedy of an estimated 700 immigrants who have perhaps drowned in the Mediterranean due to trying to find a better life for themselves in Europe or the UK. Farage said that may be due to Cameron's policy of destabilising Libya. Do you think he was using it for political point scoring, or what's your view on that?
Obviously Cameron was using it for political point scoring, and it has the potential to be quite damaging to UKIP, because most people are compassionate, loving human beings who don't like to see suffering, and if people are so desperate to better their lot, they're prepared to risk their lives like that. It does make you think, ooh, shouldn't we be doing something? But the point here really, if we look at it sensibly, is that you don't get to complain about this stuff unless you take one of two positions that are going to prevent it from happening. The two positions that will prevent immigrants from risking their lives on boats to come to your country are as follows. One, you admit nobody, like Singapore. Nobody gets killed trying to get to Singapore because they know that when they get to Singapore, they'll simply get turned away. Or you let everybody in like the Greens want to. If you have any position between those 2 points, you don't really get to complain about immigrants trying to smuggle their way into the country, because it's going to happen. I talk to a lot of young people who feel very underrepresented or simply not represented in the intellectual environment around them at university. I mean, there are UKIP student societies that have been banned from campus, which is an extraordinary thing to have happened, but I think it underscores how utterly the sort of authoritarian far left has conquered the sphere of academia. And I think it starts with professors. It doesn't come out of a vacuum. Students don't arrive at university as radical feminists or as some other minority with a chip on their shoulder, determined to interpret the facts of history through the prism of oppression and privilege and victimhood. They're taught how to do that, and I think they're taught how to do it by an overwhelmingly left-wing academic establishment. It does worry me. As far as the funding stuff goes, I think that it must have a knock-on effect when universities, particularly London universities, are overwhelmingly, not overwhelmingly funded, but they'll have significant amounts of funding from the European Union. It's just not plausible to claim that it has no effect on what they might, or on, for example, the courses they offer, which itself has a significant it creates a significant impression of people's minds. European studies. What is European studies? People study European studies, and most of those courses are funded by the EU. Now, there are people doing those courses who don't necessarily believe the pro-EU propaganda that the professors are all teaching them as though it were historical fact. But the fact that they operate these courses at all is only as a result of EU money. So I think there are a lot of questions to ask around that. I think there are a lot of valid concerns that people have about possible biases based on where funding comes from. And it is undeniably true that academia is saturated with a very specific, quite fringe, metropolitan, and quite extreme set of political opinions, which is shaping how young people are being taught. The good news is many of them are resisting that, and they're sort of sitting back in the lecture hall thinking, yeah, all right, mate, and then they go out into real life unencumbered by it. But there are plenty of young people who are influenced by it, and who genuinely believe, for example, that Britain is a country riddled with racism and sexism and homophobia, which it simply isn't. Look, it's quite easy to make fun of UKIP for, being worried about EU colouring books. But actually, when you look at the ways in which these hard left campaigners, who do control, academics and publishing and all the rest of it, seek to share their opinions with children, I do find it a bit sinister. I find it a bit sinister when kids of 4 and 5 years old are given colouring books that celebrate gay relationships or lesbian relationships, or even now transgender identity. I do find that unsettling. I do think that that perhaps children should be left alone until they're a little bit older to make an informed choice about that, rather than simply being instructed that certain sorts of lifestyles or that certain things simply are true. To take the transgender example, the science is very much out on a lot to do with a transgender disorder, and the fact is that my view on this is that we may well look back in 50 years' time and wonder how we could ever have been so cruel as to take mentally ill people and vandalise their bodies to make reality conform to delusion. It's according to a lot of the scientific papers I read, it's a psychiatric disorder which would be better treated by therapy and drugs. But we've decided, or at least the left establishment has decided, that this is the next civil rights frontier, and it is just as valid a lifestyle choice and just as valid an identity as gays and lesbians. I don't think they have anything in common at all. And I do worry when I see, for example, these young colouring books, celebrating transgender identity that are being given to children as young as 5 and 6. This is not scaremongering. It does happen, particularly in the States. And so when you get kids who are given colouring books telling them that the European Union is this glittering utopia, and we all know the real truth about that, it makes me wonder what's wrong with the parents, that they feel the need to do that to their children so early. And if you're laughing at UKIP for making fun of colouring books, I would simply say, and the people who do it on the left, I would simply say, well, look at what your arguments. When you say that video games can make people sexist, these are grown adults with established belief systems, and you say that video games can make them sexist. Imagine how impressionable young children are, and then try to defend books, then try to defend to me books that are impressing political opinions and social principles on children as young as 5 and 6. It's wrong.